It was the first winter break I wasn't spending at home. After months of nagging, my professor had finally convinced me to take an internship opportunity with the university's archaeology department. I was excited. 2 weeks at a remote research facility in Montana, helping catalog recently unearthed artifacts from an ancient settlement. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a chance to get real-world experience in my field. The facility itself was modest, a series of interconnected cabins nestled deep in the forest. It was isolated, with no phone signal and only a single landline in the main cabin. The snow was relentless, and by the time I arrived, it had piled up so high that the trees looked like skeletal hands clawing at the sky. There were only 4 of us staying at the site. Dr. Whitaker, the lead archaeologist, 2 graduate students named Emily and Jonah, and me, the lone undergraduate intern. Everyone seemed friendly enough, but there was a strange tension in the air, like everyone was on edge about something. On the first night, as we gathered around the fireplace in the main cabin, Emily broke the silence. "Did Dr. Whitaker tell you about the previous team?" she asked, her tone casual, but her eyes betraying unease. "No," I said, looking at Dr. Whitaker. He stiffened in his chair, clearly not thrilled with the question. "It's not important," he said curtly, waving a hand dismissively. "Let's focus on the work at hand." But Emily wasn't deterred. "The last team left early," she continued, leaning forward. "They said they were hearing things. Voices in the woods. At first, they thought it was animals, but then they started finding things." "Emily, enough," Dr. Whitaker snapped, his voice sharp. "You'll only scare the boy." I forced a laugh, though my curiosity was piqued. "Scare me? I'm sure I can handle a few spooky stories." Jonah shook his head. "It's not just stories," he muttered under his breath. "This place has history." Dr. Whitaker stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "We have a lot of work to do tomorrow," he said, ignoring Jonah. "I suggest we all get some rest." The conversation ended there, but I couldn't shake the unease that lingered. That night, as I lay in my bunk in one of the smaller cabins, I thought I heard something outside. At first, I told myself it was just the wind, but then I heard it again. Faint, almost melodic. A whispering voice, carried on the cold breeze. "Help me." I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The whisper was so soft, so distant, that I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Almost. I grabbed my flashlight and tiptoed to the window, peering out into the snowy darkness. The beam of light revealed nothing but endless white and the dark silhouettes of trees. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, the mood was tense. Dr. Whitaker was more irritable than usual, barking orders and snapping at questions. Emily avoided him, sticking close to Jonah as we sorted through boxes of artifacts. Among the pottery shards and tools, there were carvings, crude figures etched into stone. One caught my eye, a humanoid shape with elongated limbs and hollow eyes. It sent a chill down my spine. "What's this supposed to be?" I asked, holding up the carving. Jonah glanced at it and frowned. "They think it's some kind of forest spirit. The indigenous tribes in this area had stories about it. Something that watches from the trees." "Lovely," I said, setting it down carefully. "Just what I need to hear." Emily leaned over, lowering her voice. "They say the spirit protects the forest, but if you disturb its domain, dig up what should stay buried, it gets angry." "Emily, please," Dr. Whitaker said sharply, not looking up from his work. "This is an academic environment, not a campfire." I shared a look with Emily and Jonah, their discomfort matching my own. That evening, I stayed behind in the main cabin to organize notes while the others went to the dining cabin for dinner. The quiet was almost oppressive, broken only by the creak of wood and the howl of the wind. As I flipped through Dr. Whitaker's journal, I stumbled across a page that made my blood run cold. It detailed a previous excavation, one that had ended abruptly when workers began reporting strange phenomena. Objects moving on their own, shadows in the woods, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. The last entry was hastily scrawled. "We should not have disturbed it." A loud thud from outside made me jump. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, stepping into the freezing air. Snowflakes danced in the beam of light as I scanned the area. The noise had come from behind the cabin. Hello? I called, my voice trembling. Is someone there? The only response was the wind. But as I turned to go back inside, I saw them. Footprints in the snow, leading away from the cabin and into the woods. They were fresh, the edges still sharp, but they didn't look like normal footprints. The toes were elongated, the heel narrow and pointed. I backed up toward the door, every nerve in my body screaming to run. That's when I saw it, a shadowy figure at the tree line. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, and its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unrelenting. I stumbled inside, slamming the door and locking it. My breath came in shallow gasps as I pressed my back against the wood, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The figure hadn't followed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching. When the others returned, I told them what I'd seen. Dr. Whitaker dismissed it as a trick of the light, but Emily and Jonah exchanged uneasy glances. "You're not the first to see it," Jonah said quietly. "The last team reported something similar before they left." Emily nodded. "Whatever's out there, it doesn't want us here." I didn't sleep that night, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know what awaited us in the days to come. The next morning, I was reluctant to step outside. The memory of the shadowy figure lingered in my mind. Its hollow presence burned into my thoughts. The others noticed my unease, though they didn't push me for details. Dr. Whitaker remained skeptical of what I'd seen, dismissing my account with a wave of his hand. "Just your imagination," he said flatly over breakfast. "The mind plays tricks in environments like this. Snow, isolation. It's enough to make anyone see things." Emily wasn't convinced. "We all know something isn't right here," she said, her tone firm. "Ignoring it doesn't make it go away." Dr. Whitaker shot her a glare. "Enough of this nonsense. We're here to work, not to scare each other." Jonah gave me a sympathetic glance as we prepared to head to the excavation site. The footprints I'd seen the night before had been erased by fresh snowfall, but I still felt uneasy as we trekked into the forest. At the site, the tension was palpable. The wind howled through the trees, carrying a haunting melody that sent shivers down my spine. We worked in silence, cataloging artifacts and taking notes, but my mind kept wandering to the figure I'd seen. What was it? Why was it watching us? Around midday, Emily called out, breaking the silence. "Guys, come look at this." She was standing near a shallow pit, holding something in her gloved hands. It was another carving, similar to the one I'd seen before but more detailed. The figure was humanoid but grotesque, with sharp teeth and empty eyes. The longer I looked at it, the more it seemed to exude a sense of malice. "This is different," Jonah said, his voice low. "The carvings we've found so far have been more abstract. This one feels intentional." Dr. Whitaker examined the carving, his expression unreadable. "It's a fascinating find," he said after a moment. "We'll take it back to the cabin for further study." Emily hesitated. "Maybe we shouldn't disturb it." Dr. Whitaker's eyes narrowed. "We're here to uncover the past, not to indulge in superstition." I couldn't shake the feeling that taking the carving was a mistake, but I didn't say anything. The unease in the pit of my stomach only grew as we packed up for the day and headed back to the cabin. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind outside had grown louder, almost like a voice whispering unintelligible words. I lay in my bunk, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it, a faint tapping at the window. I froze, my heart pounding. The tapping came again, rhythmic and deliberate. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window, dreading what I might see. At first, there was nothing, just the reflection of the dim lantern light. But then, a shadow moved across the glass. I bolted upright, grabbing my flashlight and shining it at the window. The beam illuminated nothing but swirling snow. The tapping had stopped. "What's wrong?" Emily's voice startled me. She was standing in the doorway, a concerned look on her face. I thought I saw something," I stammered, my voice shaky. Emily walked over to the window, peering outside. "It's probably just the wind," she said, though her tone lacked conviction. Before she could say more, a loud crash echoed from the main cabin. We both jumped, our eyes meeting in shared fear. That didn't sound like the wind, Emily whispered. We grabbed our jackets and flashlights, waking Jonah as we rushed outside. The snow crunched beneath our boots as we made our way to the main cabin. The door was wide open, swinging on its hinges. Inside, the room was in chaos. Papers were scattered, shelves overturned, and the carving Emily had found was lying in the center of the floor, split in two. Dr. Whitaker was nowhere to be seen. Dr. Whitaker? Jonah called out, his voice trembling. There was no answer. Emily picked up the broken carving, her hands shaking. "It's angry," she said, her voice barely audible. "Who's angry?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Before she could respond, the lights flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. Jonah cursed under his breath as we fumbled with our flashlights. When the beams finally cut through the darkness, we saw it. The same shadowy figure I'd seen before, standing just outside the open door. Its elongated limbs and hollow eyes seemed to absorb the light, and it tilted its head in a way that felt almost curious. None of us moved, paralyzed by fear. Then, without warning, it stepped inside. "Run!" Jonah shouted, breaking the spell. We bolted out the back door, not daring to look back. The snow was deep, slowing our progress, but adrenaline kept us moving. I could hear the figure behind us, its movements unnaturally fast despite the terrain. We made it to the tool shed, slamming the door shut and barricading it with whatever we could find. Our breaths came in ragged gasps as we listened for any sign of pursuit. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the tapping began again, this time on the shed door. "It's toying with us," Emily whispered, her face pale. "What does it want?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jonah shook his head. "I don't think it wants anything. I think it's punishing us." The tapping grew louder, more insistent. The door rattled as if something was trying to force it open. I clenched my fists, trying to think of a way out, but my mind was blank. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. We waited in tense silence, not daring to move. Minutes passed, then hours. When the first light of dawn broke through the cracks in the shed, we finally dared to venture outside. The figure was gone, but the footprints in the snow told a chilling story. They circled the shed multiple times before disappearing into the forest. We didn't stick around to investigate. We packed up what we could carry and left the site, leaving behind the excavation, the cabins, and the shadowy figure that haunted them. To this day, I don't know what it was or why it targeted us, but I've never set foot in a forest again. It all started in September 2019, right after I moved into the small, off-campus apartment complex. I was excited to finally have a place of my own, away from the cramped dorms and their never-ending noise. The rent was cheap, and the apartment itself wasn't bad, just a little old and worn down. The only odd thing was the basement. During my first tour, the landlord, a wiry man with a permanent scowl, had specifically warned me not to go down there. "The basement's off limits," he had said curtly, as if the subject didn't deserve further discussion. At the time, I didn't question it. I had no reason to. But a few weeks later, when strange things started happening, that basement became an obsession. The first incident was small. I'd been studying late one night, the only light coming from my desk lamp. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement, a shadow darting across the room. I chalked it up to exhaustion and kept working. But over the next few days, the shadows became more frequent, more defined. They seemed to linger in the corners of the apartment, just out of reach. One night, as I was brushing my teeth, I heard a faint tapping. It was so quiet I almost didn't notice it. I stopped and listened, trying to locate the source. It was coming from beneath the bathroom floor. My apartment was on the ground level, so the realization sent a shiver down my spine. "Probably just pipes," I muttered, trying to calm myself. But the tapping didn't sound like pipes. It was rhythmic, deliberate, almost like Morse code. The next morning, I asked my neighbor, Claire, if she'd ever heard strange noises. She hesitated, her face pale. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but I just ignore it. This building's old, creaky floors and all that." Her tone was dismissive, but the way she avoided eye contact told me she was hiding something. I decided to investigate on my own. That evening, I went down to the basement door. It was locked, just as the landlord had said. I pressed my ear against the wood, but I couldn't hear anything. Frustrated, I returned to my apartment, trying to focus on my coursework. But the tapping returned, louder this time. I grabbed my phone and recorded the sound. When I played it back, the tapping was clear. 3 short knocks, 3 long ones, then 3 short again. It wasn't random. It was SOS. By now, the fear was setting in. I emailed the landlord, asking if there was something in the basement, but his reply was curt: "Stay out of it." That night, I dreamed of the basement door. In the dream, it was wide open, revealing a staircase that seemed to go on forever. Something was down there. Something with glowing eyes that watched me from the shadows. I woke up drenched in sweat, the sound of tapping still echoing in my ears. Over the next few days, I became increasingly paranoid. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, felt sinister. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but the shadows and noises wouldn't stop. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. Armed with a flashlight, I went back to the basement door. The lock was rusty, the metal brittle. I managed to pry it open with a flathead screwdriver, my hands shaking the entire time. The basement was cold, the air thick with the smell of mildew. My flashlight flickered as I descended the creaky stairs, each step echoing unnaturally. The walls were lined with old shelves, covered in cobwebs. But what caught my attention was the far corner. There was something on the floor, a large wooden chest, partially obscured by a tattered blanket. I approached cautiously, the tapping sound growing louder with each step. It wasn't coming from the chest, but from somewhere below it. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but curiosity won out. I knelt beside the chest, my hands trembling as I lifted the blanket. What I saw made my heart stop. It was an old, rusted hatch embedded in the floor. The tapping was coming from inside. For what felt like an eternity, I just stared at the hatch, my heart pounding in my chest. The rhythmic tapping continued, 3 short knocks, 3 long ones, 3 short again. My flashlight wavered in my hand as I debated what to do. "Hello?" I finally called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone down there?" The tapping stopped. A wave of nausea washed over me. Part of me hoped it was just an old pipe making noise, but deep down, I knew better. Something, or someone, was under that hatch. I steeled myself and grabbed the edge of the hatch's handle. It was ice cold, rough with rust. I had to use both hands to wrench it open, the hinges squealing loudly in protest. Beneath was a dark, narrow tunnel, its walls reinforced with concrete. A metal ladder led down into the void. "Hey!" I called again. No response. I shone my flashlight into the tunnel, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. That's when I saw them. Scratches along the walls, as though someone had clawed at the concrete in desperation. Every instinct told me to close the hatch and run, but the thought of leaving without knowing the truth gnawed at me. Against my better judgment, I began climbing down the ladder, the flashlight clenched between my teeth. The air grew colder the deeper I went, thick with the scent of damp earth. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in a small, circular chamber. The walls were lined with strange symbols etched into the concrete, symbols that looked ancient, almost ritualistic. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief, horrifying moment, I thought I saw movement in the corner of the room. But when I aimed the beam, there was nothing there. "Hello?" I called out again, my voice echoing unnaturally. "Is someone here?" This time, I got an answer. A faint, raspy whisper came from somewhere in the darkness. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't a plea for help, it was a warning. I backed up instinctively, my flashlight trembling in my hand. That's when I noticed something on the floor in the center of the room. A pile of old, tattered clothing. Among the garments were photos, yellowed and crumpled with age. I knelt down and picked one up. It was a picture of a young woman, standing in front of my apartment building. She was smiling, holding up a set of keys. Scrawled on the back was a date, September 1987. The next photo was worse. It was the same woman, but this time, her face was contorted in fear, her eyes wide and her mouth open in a silent scream. Her hands were pressed against a glass surface, as though she were trapped inside something. My stomach churned as I rifled through the photos. There were dozens, all of different people. Men, women, even children. Each set followed the same pattern. A happy moment outside the apartment building, followed by a horrifying shot of terror. That's when I heard it, the tapping again, this time coming from behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Standing at the edge of the room was a figure, shrouded in shadows. I couldn't make out its features, but its presence was suffocating. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching me. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What do you want?" The figure tilted its head slightly, as though curious. Then, it raised an arm and pointed at the ladder. I didn't need any further encouragement. I bolted for the ladder, scrambling up as fast as I could. The tapping followed me, echoing up the tunnel, growing louder and more frantic with each passing second. By the time I reached the top and slammed the hatch shut, I was gasping for air. I didn't sleep that night. I barricaded the basement door with furniture and stayed up until dawn, clutching a kitchen knife. When the sun finally rose, I called the landlord and demanded answers. His reaction was chilling. "I warned you not to go down there," he said flatly. "Whatever you saw, it's your problem now. You're on your own." I moved out the next day, breaking my lease and leaving most of my belongings behind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that whatever was in that basement had attached itself to me. Even now, months later, I still hear the tapping sometimes. 3 short knocks, 3 long ones, 3 short again. And every time, I wonder if it's a warning or a threat. In early October 2023, my roommate, Jason, and I decided to move off campus. The dorms were too noisy, and privacy was non-existent. We found a small, run-down house a couple of miles from the university, nestled at the edge of the woods. It wasn't perfect, peeling paint, a creaky floor, and a slightly damp smell, but it was affordable, and we needed the change. From the moment we moved in, there was something eerie about the place. Jason joked that the house probably had ghosts, but I laughed it off. I chalked up the uneasy feeling to stress from classes and the impending midterms. About 2 weeks after settling in, I started noticing little things out of place. My keys would vanish from the table where I'd left them, only to show up in my backpack. Jason swore he wasn't messing with me, and I believed him. He was as absent-minded as I was. "This house just has a way of messing with your head," he'd say. One night, Jason was out at a party, and I was alone. I decided to catch up on a research paper, setting up in the living room with my laptop and a cup of coffee. Around 10 p.m., the scratching started. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, coming from the back door. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. "Probably just a raccoon," I muttered to myself. Still, I couldn't help but check. I turned on the porch light, but when I peeked through the curtain, nothing was there. The backyard was empty, just the dark outline of trees swaying in the breeze. Feeling foolish, I went back to my laptop. But the scratching started again, louder this time. I decided to record it. I grabbed my phone and opened the voice recorder, creeping back to the door. As I held the phone up, the sound stopped abruptly. That's when I noticed it, on the other side of the glass, a faint outline of something, maybe a face, staring back at me. My breath caught in my throat. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my phone. "Jason, is that you?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no answer. I grabbed a kitchen knife and flung the door open, but there was no one there. The porch was empty, and the yard was silent except for the distant chirping of crickets. My hands were shaking as I locked the door and checked all the windows. When Jason came home hours later, I told him what had happened. He laughed it off. "You've been watching too many horror movies, man." But the next night, it happened again. This time, the scratching started on the window of my bedroom. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I heard it. The rhythmic scrape of nails, or claws, on glass. I turned off my lamp and crept toward the window, heart pounding. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice barely above a whisper. The scratching stopped, but a shadow lingered just beyond the curtain. Summoning every ounce of courage, I yanked the curtain open. Nothing. The yard was bathed in pale moonlight, empty as before. The next morning, Jason and I decided to set up a camera. We didn't have anything fancy, just an old webcam we found in one of the house's drawers. We mounted it on the porch and connected it to my laptop. That night, Jason had to pull an all-nighter at the library, leaving me alone again. I tried to focus on my homework, but my eyes kept darting to the laptop screen, where the live feed from the porch played. For hours, nothing happened. Then, just past midnight, the camera glitched. The screen went static for a second, and when it came back, there was someone standing on the porch, a man in a tattered hoodie, staring directly into the camera. I stared at the screen, heart racing as the figure on the porch tilted his head slightly, as if studying the camera. His face was obscured by the shadow of the hoodie, but his posture was unnerving, too still, too focused. I reached for my phone with trembling hands and dialed Jason. Pick up, I muttered under my breath. When he didn't answer, I debated calling the police. But the figure suddenly turned and walked off the porch, disappearing into the darkness. I watched the screen, frozen, hoping he wouldn't return. The next morning, Jason came home to find me slumped on the couch, bags under my eyes from staying up all night. I showed him the footage, expecting him to finally take things seriously. To my shock, he shrugged. Probably just some homeless guy, he said. The woods attract all kinds. That doesn't explain why he was just standing there, staring, I argued. Jason didn't respond. He seemed tense, like he knew more than he was letting on. That evening, I insisted we move the camera to my bedroom window. Jason reluctantly helped, but he didn't say much, his usual humor replaced by quiet unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't telling me something. Around 11 p.m., the scratching started again. This time, it was at the window where we had just installed the camera. I froze, my chest tightening as I stared at the live feed on my laptop. The same figure was back, crouched low and staring directly into the camera. Jason was in the next room. I rushed to get him, pulling him by the arm into my room. There. Tell me that's just some homeless guy now. Jason's face went pale as he saw the screen. Okay, that's weird. Before either of us could do anything, the figure stood up and started walking toward the back door. Jason and I exchanged a panicked look, and I grabbed the kitchen knife from under my bed. Jason, to my surprise, pulled out a baseball bat. Why do you have a bat in here? I asked, incredulous. Why do you have a knife? He shot back. The figure was now pounding on the back door. Not knocking, pounding. The sound reverberated through the house, each slam more forceful than the last. Jason and I crept into the kitchen, our weapons clutched tightly. Who's there? Jason shouted, trying to sound brave. The pounding stopped. We held our breath, waiting for the next sound. A low, guttural laugh echoed from outside, sending chills down my spine. Jason and I backed away from the door, inching toward the living room. Suddenly, the pounding resumed, this time on the living room window. The man had moved faster than seemed humanly possible. Jason swung the bat in a panic, smashing a lamp as the figure's face pressed against the glass. His features were partially visible now. Sunken eyes, a pale, gaunt face, and a crooked grin that seemed to stretch unnaturally wide. "Let me in," he rasped, his voice muffled but chillingly clear. "No way," Jason shouted, yanking me toward the hallway. We locked ourselves in my bedroom and called the police. My hands shook as I described the intruder, glancing at the camera feed on my laptop. The man was now pacing around the house, his movements jerky and unnatural. It felt like hours before we heard the sound of sirens. The figure disappeared into the woods as the red and blue lights flooded the yard. The police searched the area but found no one. They assured us it was probably just a drifter, but their nervous expressions told a different story. Jason and I decided to move out the next morning. As we packed up, Jason finally confessed. "I didn't want to freak you out, but I heard weird stuff about this house before we moved in. People said it's cursed or something. I thought it was just small-town rumors." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. We left that day and never looked back. But sometimes, late at night, I still check my windows, half expecting to see that face staring back at me.